Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you've stayed warm today. This is Laura Davis. I am a UMass board member as well as a staff member at NOFA. I help processors and farmers navigate their organic certification. I also do some soil consulting. Today, I'm really excited to hear when and how to kill cover crops. That's going to be presented by Arthur Siller. I do also have a farm of my own, and I'm always challenged by this very topic. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Arthur has to say. Before we get started and I introduce Arthur, just a few items to cover. First of all, UMass is strengthening our commitment to racial equity and justice by examining whiteness and dismantling systems of white supremacy that are part of many dominant systems, including our agriculture and food systems. We also want to honor the indigenous land stewards who are the original occupants of the land that we are currently inhabiting. You can use the link to find what property that you are currently living on and working in. Lastly, we want to call on everyone, especially white allies and co-conspirators, to action on a few items to assist BIPOC-led organizations. Those actions are listed on the slide. Also, there are two events I just wanted to make you aware of. One is a BIPOC caucus tomorrow from 1 to 2, and the other one is a Spanish speakers caucus that's happening tomorrow from 5:30 to 6:30. And you're probably all pretty familiar with these norms. We have you muted. If you are going to ask a question, we'll let you come off a mute. Please use the chat feature. And also this session is being recorded for future use. We hope that you will all help us thank our sponsors, and some of these sponsors too are available online as well. We have an auction that's part of our fundraiser that's got a lot of great items for sale. So get on there and see if you can win something with the best price. Okay. Okay, with that, I'm going to have an introduction of our workshop presenter. Arthur Siller uses they, them pronouns, is a PhD student in Hashemi lab at UMass Amherst. They have extensive experience in sustainable farming practices with current research on cover crop termination strategies to reduce off-farm resources and to improve soil health. With that, I would like to welcome Arthur and ask him to load his slides up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Yeah, I think Laura covered my introduction or whatever. And I'll just say, as far as if people have questions during the talk, like feel free to chat, and Laura will be looking at the chat if something comes up, or I'm not sure if you're able to unmute and just ask a question, that's also fine. We should have some time at the end of the presentation as well for questions and to talk. I'm happy to stick around, talk about like specific issues that people are having or thinking about coming up on your farms or in your garden, to sort of, you know, there's as with most farming things, there's not going to be like oh, this is the right answer, but it can be helpful just to talk about things. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in this workshop with a lot of knowledge about, you know, their own experiences and things they've seen over the years. And so happy to, yeah, so definitely feel free to share your experiences as we go. So I'm going to load my slides and we'll get started. Sorry. Okay, so yeah, the topic of our workshop today is how and when to kill cover crops. And yeah, a lot of, so there's an experiment here with some different cover crop termination methods with tillage, and you can see some roller crimped rye on the side here. So just to get started, I'm sure people are quite familiar with cover crops, but why do we do it? What benefits are we trying to sort of maximize in determining our termination strategies? So they capture more sunlight during the time of the year that cash crops aren't there, reduce weeds, recycle nitrogen, add organic matter, encourage beneficial insects, protect the soil from erosion, generally improve the soil structure, and reduce like off-farm pollution coming from mostly from nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as like soil particles in the environment. So yeah, and oops. So obviously, like cover crops come with some challenges, like they don't make any money. It can actually be pest habitat, sort of unfortunate. A little bit more expensive. And the main thing we're going to be talking about today, which is they're more complicated than not cover cropping. This picture is a field of lamb's quarters. That's just it's a free cover crop that maybe doesn't work as well as some of the ones that you have to pay for the seeds. But honestly, it's not the worst thing either. So good transitions between cash crops and cover crops are going to sort of maximize the benefits that you get from the whole cropping system. So today I'm planning on talking about like specifically winter cover crops and killing them in the winter and spring, just because that's kind of the most common thing in our area. But a lot of like what we're talking about is also applicable to a summer cover crop. And if people have specific questions about like how this would translate to a summer cover crop in our area, I'm happy to talk about that sort of stuff as well. And the reason these are, the winter cover crops are sort of very important is that we have some really good cover crop options that can handle colder temperatures and lower light levels than most of our important cash crops. So the thing that's kind of challenging is like where to start with the conversation of like when and how to kill cover crops, because everything, like everything about the cover crops is affected by the things that come before it, the things that come after it. You're not going to, it's not like, okay, if this one time period, then you can just go off of that. So some things that are, like the plant that comes before the cash crop that comes before the cover crop will determine what your cover crop options are. Your cover crop options that you have to plant, some of them can be killed in different ways than other ones. And then the cash crop that you're going to plant afterwards, you're going to need the cover crop to be killed in either particular ways or particular times. And then one thing that's really important to remember is that like kind of the big goal of this workshop is to kind of go through a bunch of options so that, when you come into the spring, like, kind of cover crop killing season / cash crop planting season, knowing the different options that are out there for killing cover crops is going to be a way to increase flexibility in the farming season, to work around weather, to work around off-farm jobs, to work around just all the logistical things. And certainly, like, generally increased knowledge is a great way to sort of increase flexibility in the farming system. So speaking of flexibility, the kind of the most, the thing that's kind of the most flexible in the spring, that gives you the most options in the short run, is no cover crop. And so that's like, it can seem really attractive, and you'll see a lot of, farms where the easiest way to have a cover the easiest thing to do in the winter around the cash cropping systems is no cover crop. And so there's some downsides to that. Hopefully farms will at least, be able to leave some residue, let some weeds kind of hang out in the fields if you can't get a cover crop in. But the goal here is to kind of narrow the gap between the flexibility of no cover crop, and to sort of help folks find enough flexibility in the cover cropping to make it worthwhile. So you get a lot of benefits in the long term, even if it can make spring a little bit more hectic to cover crop. So because we can't really start with one thing, we're going to go through like things that go into cover crop termination in 3 different ways. We're going to we're going to go through some different methods of terminating cover crops. We're going to go through sort of some different common cover crops and what ways to kill them work best for each crop. And we're going to talk about the cash crop growing season and how that affects cover crop killing methods. So the 4 ways to kill cover crops that we're going to mostly talk about today are winter kill. So that's, and we'll get into it a little bit more. Tillage. It's very, we're going to mostly be talking in general about tillage. Definitely there's a lot to talk about with tillage. Tarps and roller crimpers. And then we'll talk a little bit about like mixed termination methods, where you might have a mixed cover crop stand, and some of the crops in that stand are going to be killed in one way, and some of the crops are going to be killed in another way. We're also going to touch a little bit on mowing, which is kind of a supplementary cover crop termination step. Whoa, how did I get all the way? Oops, sorry, I accidentally got forward. I wanted to just say this in case folks, I don't have another picture of a roller crimper, I think later on, but this is a roller crimper here. So we'll talk more about it. So these are some winter killed oats here. They're partially winter killed, so they're gonna die. But so winter killing is just when you plant a cover crop that can't live through the winter in our area. So the benefits of that are, that it is less work. You don't have to do anything to kill the cover crop. You're not going to get volunteer seedlings of the cover crop in the next year's crop. It'll add a moderate amount of organic matter to the soil, especially if you can plant it early enough. These are not super late crops because they can't handle the cold temperatures as well. They're pretty good for biennial weed control, even though they are not going to be, active in the spring. They'll really cut down on the fall growth of things like shepherd's purse or, mustard weeds. The main reason people would tend to do this is that it's going to leave the field as ready to plant as possible after a cover crop. And these winter kill covers can also be a really great way to do a nurse crop for people do it a lot for pastures, but as in a cover cropping system for if you want to have a year-long cover crop of something like red clover, where you're going to leave the field in a covered fallow for the next year. And it's a great option for early crops like onions, potatoes, that sort of thing, early brassicas. So the downsides to the winter killing is that you can see this is a field in the spring. There's not a lot on the ground here compared to a big field, full of a living cover crop. There's still a fair amount of residue there, but it's a lot better than nothing, but not too much there. It's also not going to, have any more nitrogen available than a in the spring. The nitrogen that's collected by these plants, which is not everything that doesn't end up in kind of the soil organic matter pool, is going to be lost to the groundwater, to the air again. And then any surviving weeds will still need to be killed before the planting. So you're still going to have to do some sort of field prep. It doesn't totally get you out of having to deal with weeds. Unfortunately, nothing does. So we'll move on to talking about tillage, which is something I think everybody's probably pretty familiar with. Has a lot of benefits. It's a really versatile way of killing cover crops. You can basically kill anything with tillage, any plant. They really don't like it. And it's going to give your sort of soil microbiology like a little bit of a jump start by aerating the soil in the spring, getting all that oxygen in there, and kind of help to drain the top of the soil, so you can get a little bit of a head start on like soil warmth and microbial activity with tillage. It's going to make a nice seed bed for small seeded plants, and small transplants. And one thing it does really well is it incorporates all that above ground matter really well into the soil, and gets it mixed in for decomposition. One of the biggest benefits about tillage is that it is a really well developed cropping system for the kind of crops that we use. A lot of the crops are kind of bred to do really well in this sort of system, and it's something where you're going to be able to find recommendations for basically any crop that you want. When you're able to find really good recommendations, your neighbors will have experience with it, and that can really help just to troubleshoot any issues that you have. So at the same time, it's got some pretty big downsides. So tillage is really disruptive to the soil ecosystem, really disruptive to the soil structure, the way that the particles of soil kind of hold together, and the sort of spaces in between the soil particles is really not helped by tillage. It's still going to take several weeks for some cover crops to die from tillage, and they're going to take just can be a lot of work for some of the more vigorous cover crops. Might be several passes over the field, even with a pretty heavy duty tractor. It is, and so that is going to be some more steps you can have if you can't get into the fields because they're too wet in the spring. It can be then you can't kill your cover crop with tillage. You just get your tractor stuck. And after the tillage, the soils are very vulnerable to erosion. And I don't really just mean only erosion where you'd see a big gully leading out of the field, but even sort of very small scale erosion where clay particles are, getting disrupted. Maybe they're only moving a couple inches, but you're still getting particles of clay sealing up the entry to the soil, sealing up the water, not letting air in, and reducing the overall sort of quality of the soil by even just no soil moving even more than a foot or something. You can still really lose some of the capacity of the soil there. Like I said, mowing may be another step that has to go with this for larger mature cover crops. And then finally, something that will come up with when we're talking about timing is that incorporating like high carbon cover crop residues can actually reduce the nitrogen availability in the soil after that. So if you take like a, kind of mature rye or wheat, something that's got, a lot of biomass that's really high in carbon and not very high in nitrogen, and you mix that into the soil, that can the microbes in the soil will really love that, and they will eat all the nitrogen that's in the soil at the same time, leaving very little for your plants until those microbes die. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about tarps here. So I don't know if folks have used tarps, but it's basically you get a big tarp, you spread it over the field. It's something that has been done for a long time on sort of a garden and landscaping scale, but over the last 10, 15 years or whatever has started to be used, and I'm sure people were doing it before then as well, on kind of a moderate sized farm scale where you're talking about half an acre to several acres at a time, using the kind of tarps that are used for bunker silos on dairy farms. And the benefits of this are that it can, in the spring, when you've got your wet, cold soil, you actually can keep extra water from rain getting into the soil. It'll end up on the side of the field. Your side of the field will be wetter, but right in the tarped area will actually start to dry out and drain a little quicker than it would if it was getting those spring rains. And you can see a lot of the tarps will have one side that's black. And so if you put the black side up, it'll actually warm up the soil as well. And you can get a pretty big jump start on the season. Getting it's not that everything catches up, but it'll warm things up and dry them out a little bit quicker. It's, obviously with no-till in general, you're going to get a much less disturbed soil structure and sort of ecological diversity in the soil. They're really great when combined. Like, you can kill basically any plant by cutting off its light. And so, they're really pretty versatile and you're able to kill with a combination of mowing for any, to get the residue down low enough, and tarping, you can kill most cover crops pretty easily. And the residues obviously are left on the soil, and depending on how much residue you have, that can actually end up being kind of a mulch after the tarping. And they also, as I said, they will kill most plants, and so they will kill weeds as well, which is great. So the drawbacks of tarps, and this is row cover in the front on this picture, but in the back there's some tarps there. I didn't want you to think that the row cover was a tarp, but so they're pretty logistically difficult for large areas. When we start talking about acres and acres, tarping gets pretty complicated. It's vulnerable to blowing around in the wind, and you need a lot of sandbags or something else to hold the tarps down. They're you still need several weeks at least to kill cover crops, and then you have sort of waste and storage issues with the tarps, of whether you're throwing away the tarps every couple of years. They're not going to last forever, and if you are saving them for multiple years, like, you have to have a place that you can store a pretty big tarp and keep mice out of it and that sort of thing. So it's, and some of this is things that I think you end up, some of these, in comparison with tillage, where it's like, yes, everything's kind of known. And when you start talking about the tarps and roller crimping, there's a lot more uncertainty and a lot more troubleshooting that you'll have to do kind of more on your own, more finding places to talk to rather than being like, oh yes, everybody's done this. We all know what happens when you plow a field. Here's the good things, here's the bad things. So there's a few more unknowns with these systems. So this brings us to roller crimping, which is, just in case folks aren't familiar, the idea with roller crimping is you push all the cover crop down, and you can see on the picture here that all the stems are broken. They're not cut, but they're just broken about every foot. They'll get broken, and the idea is that this kills the plant, but it doesn't kill it it's a less shocking way of killing the plant. And so rather than the plant just immediately trying to regrow from the roots, the plant will kind of try and keep the whole plant alive. And so it'll expend its resources more than if you just go and mow a field. You'll get a lot more regrowth because the plant will, the resources from the roots of the plant, whatever energy they still have, will try and regrow, knowing that something has come and taken the whole top. And with the roller crimping, it's I think a little bit, and maybe this is too anthropomorphizing, but it seems more confusing to the plants, and doesn't get them on the whole, doesn't get them to reset as much as mowing would. And so you have, you don't end up with as many new little shoots coming out. So the benefits of this is that the mulch is, you can get a very nice mulch, and it provides quite a bit of weed control during the cash crop growing season. And the soil is covered for the entire season, which is really great. Like you don't have any of the transition between tillage. You don't have, in the spring, you don't have issues with like, how am I protecting the soil until canopy closure of the cash crop. You've got great soil cover the whole year. And the cover crop leaves and stems, they kind of sit on top of the soil, and so they break down slowly, which is great for the weeds. Like I was saying, it's also great because these are typically, with roller crimped crops, you're talking about a pretty high carbon residue. And so instead of mixing that into the soil where it's going to encourage a lot of microbial growth right away and start tying up nitrogen, you're having that carbon is all on top of the soil and sort of slowly breaking down, and you're not getting as much the soil nitrogen is going to be more available than if you mixed all this high carbon material into the soil. Another benefit with the roller crimping is that you can basically, after you roller crimp, when the plants are still green, you can actually plant pretty quickly after that. You don't need to wait a couple weeks after killing the cover crop to plant your crops. You do have to, so the downsides, which what I say, you don't have to wait after you roller crimp the crop, but you do have to wait to roller crimp the crop. The challenges with roller crimping for a lot of cropping systems is that you really have to time the roller crimping about where the cover crop is. You do it too early, it won't work as well. If you do it too late, it won't work as well. And so you're kind of locked into how the cover crop is growing and the timing of the cover crop in the spring for how you want to do it. It also only works with some types of crops. There are some crops that you could roller crimp them every single day for a month, and they'd be fine with that. They wouldn't, like, if you cover crop or roller crimping a clover is not going to do anything to it. So this is a field that's all been roller crimped, so you can see it's just all kind of flattened out there. So some other downsides is that it is a challenging place to kind of get to the soil. So you're not really going to be able to do, carrots or something where, it's unfortunate because the weed control would be great for carrots, but getting a nice bed where a nice furrow where you can plant fine seeded cash crops is challenging because of all the mulch. And even if you get it there, then it might blow back over. And similarly, you can have challenges with sort of smaller transplants like a lettuce or something. So it's mostly a system that's going to work well for either, large seeded, direct seeded crops like a squash or a corn, or pretty large transplants like tomatoes or eggplants, that sort of thing. The residues do make really good mouse habitat. I'm including that here. There also are a lot of immature rye seeds here. And so I actually have seen, given the number of mice that I've seen in roller crimped fields, there's a lot less crop damage than you would think. And I think that's because they're eating all of the cover crop residue that's left there. But I'm not sure about that. But they are, it is a mouse paradise here, which I think, like, again, there's some of this stuff is, I think, because this is a relatively new system that's still really being explored. Like, it very well could be that in as we go on, there'll be good ways to use a roller crimped system for smaller cash crops, and like how to do that in a way that you can get sort of consistent, high quality cash crop yields. I think I'm sure we will get better and better at doing that. I've been thinking about whether we should have we have like beneficial insects that you can get. And I was thinking about all the mice and thinking about if somebody maybe wants to start like a beneficial snakes business where you could buy like, a couple hundred little baby snakes for your field in the spring to release so they could eat all the mice or something. I'm sure that's its own complications. So it does require, specialized equipment as well, with like the roller crimper that we saw. It's not, for a lot of equipment, it's really fairly affordable, but it still is an extra piece of equipment. And the last two things are that, weeds that do make it through the mulch generally do it's pretty challenging to, you can't hoe this. So they get pretty big. Generally, I would say if you have a nice roller crimped mulch, some weeds will get through. They probably won't have too big of an effect on the overall like cash crop yield, but they are probably going to set seeds, and it's a thing that they probably need to be out there hand weeding some. And it does require a really nice cover crop stand. So it's not something where you're going to need to look at the cover crop in the spring to see if this is going to be a sort of a viable strategy. And then just a little bit of a note on mowing. Can be a really useful extra step in terminating cover crops, just to sort of get everything chopped up, increase the surface area that microbes have to work on their decomposition, and get that all sort of like settled down next to the soil. And it's definitely necessary for, for a lot of like either tarping or tillage with a big like spring rye crop. You're just not like you're not gonna be able to put a tarp over it. It's gonna tangle up your mower. It's gonna tangle up, not your mower. It's gonna tangle up like a rototiller or clog up a plow. And so like, with big cover crops, a mower is quite useful. And it's also fairly useful as far as if the field's too wet to till and you're starting to worry your cover crops are getting too mature, starting to have potentially have seeds getting made. Mowing can be a way that you might be able to get in a field with a mower when it's still too wet to really start doing any tillage. So with like crops where you'd have a mixed termination, that would typically be that some of the things in your cover crop mix are going to winter kill, and some of the things are going to need to be killed in another way. So that might be, something like, rye and radishes, where you want the radishes to, say you have a like a no-till field and you want to use some radishes to really get some nice big channels down in the soil. But you also want something to be there all spring. You're going to tarp it. So you could do, radishes and rye and then just tarp it in the spring. The radishes are going to be dead before you tarp it. And yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about different cover crops here. And so yeah, different cover crops are going to work better at being killed at different times or using different methods. Which cover crop you have, obviously, it's going to affect your choices that you have in the spring. And just a quick note that most cover crops that we use are also have other uses as either grain or forage for animals. And you don't want to get the forage or grain varieties. They'll be fine, but I would say typically if your choice is between like sort of a special, like a brewing barley for making beer and a sort of, whatever the variety not stated barley, you're probably going to be better off going with the variety not stated barley. And it'll be a little bit cheaper, although probably not that much cheaper unless you get like a hybrid rye or something. That you can pay a lot of money, but you don't really need to for cover cropping generally. Oops, how do I get out of here? Okay. So winter kill cover crops are very straightforward. In our area, that's going to be oats, spring peas, field peas. Generally field peas means spring peas. Radishes, and most other brassicas are going to be winter kill, although there definitely are lots of brassicas that don't winter kill. And so you just want to make sure you have an idea about varieties. And that's something that extension or other farmers, probably even seed dealers, if they're should have like some ideas. And if people are interested in starting to get into brassicas, interestingly, the main place you can get like kind of different brassica cover crops that are a little bit, I don't know if you're interested in trying new things, is with people who are from like deer hunters organizations, because people plant the brassicas out to attract deer so that they can then hunt them in the winter when they come to eat the nice, delicious brassicas. So that's a good source for kind of different brassica cover crop seeds. And with most winter kill cover crops, you want to plant them by the beginning of September. So they have a lot of, because they're not going to grow any in the spring. So you want to give them a nice amount of time. And also they're just not as, they're going to die all like, this weekend is killing all the winter killed cover crops. They might have hung on till now, and maybe a few of them will hang on a little longer, but they're pretty dead now, and they won't have been very active. It was a warm fall this year, but probably for at least a month they've been pretty inactive. And the mixes of you'll see people plant oats and peas a lot, oats and red, like all these do really well in mixes together. You want to be a little bit careful not to go too heavy on the radishes, because they will get big in the and kind of outcompete the oats and peas if you but there's lots of good info about seeding rates and that sort of things out there. So rye is probably one of our favorite cover crops. It's you can kill it with tillage, tarps, or roller crimper, you probably have to go to, I don't even know how far north you'd have to go to winter kill rye, pretty far. It's not going to happen unless you plant it like super duper late and it didn't really get established, and then you can do it here. But, so, you know, the options with rye is you can kill it like early to mid spring with tillage or tarps. It's going to need a few weeks to break down, but it's not going to be super high in carbon at that point, and you are going to get kind of the release of the nitrogen that it captured the last fall like pretty quickly for your crops. So it's a nice balanced thing. If you kill it when it's, you know, under a foot tall, it's a nice sort of it's not going to add as much organic matter overall, but it's going to not tie up the nitrogen in the way the later residues will. And, you know, similarly, when you're using those, have that high carbon residue, keeping that residue on the surface, either with tarping or roller crimping, is going to help avoid that nitrogen tie up. If you're going to roller crimp it, you want to do that when it's like shedding pollen, which will be like late May, maybe even early June. And the thing that we all love about rye is that it can be planted super duper late and still do okay. You can, you know, you can plant rye in early November, you know, and have it and be totally fine. Especially with climate change, like that date is getting later and later. Even though, you know, eventually it gets so dark that I don't know, you know, ideally you'd plant it a little bit earlier than early November, but it does quite good. So wheat and triticale are closely related to rye. I mean, triticale is a hybrid of wheat and rye. So they're very similar to rye, but they're going to be a little bit less winter hardy than rye, which if you get a cover crop variety, there are varieties of wheat and triticale that are not as winter hardy. But generally, if you get like a winter wheat or a winter triticale, they're going to be totally winter hardy. They're going to mature a little bit later and produce a little bit less biomass than rye. So they're not going to have as big of issues with adding, you know, more nitrogen to the soil if you terminate them at a later date. But they're also going to be a little more challenging for roller crimping because they don't have as much stem per plant. So you need kind of to be a little bit extra careful to make sure you have, you know, a really good thick stand of wheat or triticale to use them for roller crimping. And we'll talk, I think I would talk about this later, but I'll just say now, like, because they do a little bit later, they can line up a little bit nicely with vetch to grow wheat and vetch or triticale and vetch together and not have kind of as much of an issue with the rye and vetch, where you have the rye kind of starting to flower and wanting to do seeds a little bit earlier than the vetch. So another option, the confusingly named annual ryegrass. I don't know the word history of rye and ryegrass, but it's not the ryegrass that's in your lawn. It's not the rye that you get bread out of. It's a different ryegrass. But it's a great cover crop. Much finer, much smaller seeds. And so the nice thing about that is that I think I must have planned to talk about this later, but the little seeds can work a little bit easier for intercropping the cover crop because they are a smaller seed. You can get them enough soil contact without having to get them so deep in the soil like a small grain. And yeah, obviously you can't use roller crimping. They won't winter kill. So it's just tillage or tarps. And, you know, you can sort of kill them anytime in the spring that you want to. It's kind of going to be more like the early termination of rye or wheat, where you're not going to have a whole lot of carbon rich material. You're going to have a pretty nice leafy thing to incorporate into the soil. So winter peas, are a type of pea. Sometimes they're called Austrian peas often, but they're basically peas that'll live through the winter. And so they're going to be, sorry, I said, when I said, anyway, you can kill them with tillage or tarps. I think if we got a really harsh winter, they might winter kill, but I don't think that's really in the cards for us anymore. And they're kind of a pretty soft residue. You know, they're going to break down pretty quickly, and as a legume, they're going to have a good amount of nitrogen. And so to kind of get the most of that nitrogen, you want to do it when they're flowering. So that's going to be kind of like middle of spring, basically. And you want to plant those kind of in September. Even early September would be nice, but they'll do all right. So on the legume train we've got hairy vetch, which is a super common cover crop, often planted with rye. It's a tenacious plant. You can definitely have weed issues with vetch. Is similar with rye as well. And so you want to be pretty careful about not having it go to seed. And so the timing of the termination is pretty important because it starts setting seeds, and it unlike rye or something, it's not going to make all the seeds at the same time. It's going to ripen the seeds at the bottom of the plant and then go up. But it's also making most of its nitrogen while it's flowering and producing seeds. So that you want to kill it when maybe about a third to a half of the plant is flowering. So you're not going to get as much nitrogen as if you let it kind of go all the way and then tilled it in. But I would say generally that's worthwhile to not have baby vetch. It doesn't look like that big of a plant when you see it out on the ground. It's not super tall, but the vines can get quite long. And mowing is really pretty key with the vetch. It's very, very tangly. If you it'll really gum up equipment if you're going in there. And yeah, it won't winter kill around here, but so either tillage or tarps with mowing. You probably wouldn't need to mow it for tarping unless it got like super big. But I mean, the thing that everybody loves about vetch is that it makes an enormous amount of nitrogen. And it makes enough nitrogen for pretty much any cash crop that you would follow it with. And so that's worth the trouble of avoiding some vetch seeds. And you're gonna want to plant it in September. So red clover, this is just kind of an example of like a longer season cover crop where you can terminate at any time. It's not something that's really it's not the best choice if you're just growing a winter cover crop. It's not going to grow as vigorously as something like vetch or peas in the spring. But if it's something where you're going to have, you're not going to be planting anything until, July in that field, or especially if you're going to have a fallow field, red clover is like a great 1 year cover. If you've got a gap in a rotation, or if you do any sort of mixed like hay, red clover is a little bit wet for hay, but pasture with crops, it's a wonderful plant. It does take a little bit of work to kill it because it's got a really strong root system, and so it'll take a fair amount of tillage, and it would probably take, I would think, at least a month with a tarp to really feel comfortable that you'd killed red clover, at least. Yeah, and it does, I think I mentioned this before, but it does really well with if you plant, say, oats and red clover in the fall, the oats will kind of keep down the winter weeds, and then the red clover starts growing quickly in the spring. It'll compete against the spring weeds, and you can mow down whatever comes through. So yeah, cover crop mixtures are a great way to go. Generally a little bit more logistically complicated in some cases, depending on how you're seeding them. But you can generally get a really nice complementary benefits from mixes, but they can be more complicated. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about rye and vetch specifically, because that's a very popular and well-known cover crop mixture. So this is going to be something you're going to need to kill with tillage or tarps. You can't roller crimp it because the vetch will live through that and it will eat your crops. At least I think hopefully we can get a little bit better at roller crimping, and maybe we could roller crimp vetch, but I don't think it's consistent enough currently to be able to to feel like that's enough of a, as things stand now. So this can be terminated kind of mid to late spring, and you're going to get kind of more nitrogen and more organic matter as you go. The nice thing about this is that the vetch produces nitrogen, the rye produces organic matter. You don't get that high carbon input nitrogen unavailability because you're adding all the nitrogen from the vetch at the same time. So you get it. It's a really nice way to do it. If the rye starts to mature too early and you want the vetch to keep going, you can kind of go through and mow the rye to set it back. You won't kill the rye by mowing it, but then it'll start regrowing again, and that can be a way to get the flowering of the rye not too far ahead of the vetch. And yeah, as you get into rye can be 5-6 feet tall when it's mature, and the vetch climbing up it, you're definitely going to want to mow that before tilling or tarping anything to kill it. So then the final way I want to kind of look at things is through the cash crop growing season. And so this, I would say, is kind of the most typical way that you'd start in thinking about cover cropping. Is you'd start thinking, when do I want to plant my crops, or when are my crops done? And then you just put a cover crop in that fits in that window. In a lot of cases, that's going to be rye. And so, yeah, the transitions are definitely the key to getting the most out of the cover crops. Getting the most out of the cover crops is key to getting the most out of the farm, in all sorts of ways. Yeah. So when we're thinking about planting cover crops late, this would be something you do if the cash crop, grows late into the fall. You can't really plant winter kill cover crops at that point. And if you have a field where you have crops there late into the fall, and then you really need to get into that field quickly in the spring, I would say probably a straw mulch is going to be better than planting oats that are going to, not really do anything before they die. Leaving the cash crop residues from the fall, and if possible, bringing, a straw or hay mulch to cover the field. Even just a little bit of, even a pretty thin layer of straw. It's not going to control weeds the next spring like you'd need for garlic or something, but will really help to kind of hold the soil and prevent rain and erosion from happening on the field in a big way. When you're planting late, a little bit heavier seeding rate for the cover crop can really help to get things going. You won't see that difference that much in the spring, because the plants will just, if you have fewer cover crop plants in the spring, they'll just get bigger. And so you'll get a fairly similar amount of coverage in kind of flexible sized plants. But it can help in the fall. And if preventing erosion over the winter is a big goal, which it usually is, that can help that to happen. So when you're planting cover crops early, we're talking about like the cash crop being done late summer, early fall. This might be something like, I don't know, cucumbers, tomatoes, or from like agronomic crops, like if you had, something like wheat for grain. And so winter kill cover crops are, going to grow really fast in the fall and be very, very productive in the fall. The cover crops that live through the winter aren't as productive in the fall. So even if you have that growing period in the fall and you're going to want to cover crop in the spring again, you might want to think about planting like a mix of winter killed cover crops and overwintering cover crops to get, kind of a lot of productivity in the fall, and then have the very productive spring cover crops come after that. Again, that's going to be a little bit more complicated to get the seed mix, and you'd be totally fine just planting. You can definitely plant rye and vetch at the end of August and it'll be fine. Like they'll do great. They'll grow a lot. They'll do really nicely. But you're going to get more productivity in the fall if you say add radishes or oats to that mixture as well. So another option for late cash crops is interseeding. So basically it's the idea that you plant your cover crop in between the cash crops. This picture, I think the cover crop looks a little bit thick, honestly, and is probably competing with the cash crops a little bit. I think this is ryegrass here, but basically you're going to want to seed at the last time that you'd cultivate the crop. You're going to want to seed a cover crop in there at the same time, and that last cultivation is both going to kill the last set of weeds, and it's also going to sort of get the cover crop seed in good enough soil contact that you get a little bit of a cover crop stand that's coming out. Now, people do also just broadcast, I don't know if people really, I don't know. Sometimes people drop cover crop seeds from airplanes to try and do this, and kind of crop dusting with seeds. But generally with broadcasting, you're not going to get as good of a seed contact, especially if you're just throwing it on the surface. You're not getting any way to really push that seed in there. So interseeded cover crops, you're going to want to plant something that's going to be able to withstand like a fair amount of foot traffic. You're still going to have to come in there with your tractor, with your, walking through there, with a truck maybe to do your harvest, whatever that is. And so like peas and brassicas are not going to be as good at handling that kind of traffic as like grasses and clovers. And I'd say vetch is kind of in the middle. One issue with interseeding is you're not going to get a really even cover crop stand. You're going to get, gaps in the cover crop where the cash crops were. And so you're not going to be able to do like roller crimping because you're going to have those gaps in that sort of situation. So when you think about cash crop planting in like early April, winter kill cover crops are going to be the easiest. The field's not going to be uncovered for too long since the cash crops are going in early. But if I would say like, depending on the season, doing tarping over the field's going to be like pretty wet for tillage for that sort of stuff. You might be able to get in there, but tarping to kill, say, rye or something, will kind of have an extra benefit for this kind of thing where you're able to kill the cover crop, but also start warming up the soil at the same time and killing weeds as well. When we're talking about planting sort of late April to mid-May, winter kill cover crops are going to leave the soil like exposed for a longer period of time. It's still not going to be like a totally bare soil because you've got the residues from winter killed cover crops are can be pretty substantial. And I would say like, um, at this point, like tillage is a pretty consistent way of doing it. You're probably going to get enough gaps in the weather and enough dried out time that you're going to be able to get in to till. A really wet spring, you can definitely have issues with getting your field work, and that can delay stuff. But it's when we're talking about late April, there usually are some gaps in there. And you really generally aren't going to need to mow cover crops if you're tilling or tarping at this point. But depends on how the cover crop looks in general. And tarping again, well, you're still at a point at this point in the season where the warmth of the tarps can still be pretty beneficial for getting crops going. Once we start to get into late May and early June, we're in a kind of a realm where if you had a winter kill cover crop and you're not going to plant until late May, you probably want to start thinking about planting a separate spring cover. So that might be planting peas or oats again as soon as you can get in the spring, just to keep that soil covered. That's going to be a long time to not have anything growing and protecting the soil and capturing sunlight. If you're talking about, basically like the end of March until the end of May, that's a lot of sunlight to not get something. And so I would say you really want to think about putting in a spring cover crop separately if you had a winter cover crop in place there. At this point, you're really probably going to need to mow to do either tillage or tarps. And then as long as the crop that you're going to put in there is good and you have, a rye or wheat, a nice rye or wheat cover crop, this is when you would be looking at roller crimping in our area. So, like to summarize, the kind of main reason we're thinking about all this is that these termination methods can really, get more available nitrogen into your crops. You don't have to fix with fertilizer. Maximize your organic matter, which is going to just really help the soil in the long run, help your nitrogen in the long run, just make everything go smoother. Minimize those gaps in cover cropping where you'd have the soil exposed to big rainstorms and erosion and soil damage. And similarly, the less sunlight that's hitting the ground, the less sunlight's hitting little tiny weeds. And so it can help with that as well. And yeah, so yeah, I'm happy to talk about questions. If people have examples they want to talk about as well, I think we've got a decent amount of time. And if yeah,
That was a lot of great information there. Arthur, thanks so much. And at this time, we'd love to take some questions from everybody or comments from everybody. I have one just to start out. When you talk about a late May, early June cash crop planting, and if there was, if the soil was bare, it's too long to leave that bare. You mentioned oats and peas. How long or how many weeks of would those need to be in there before it would be worthwhile or not?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like, like if you're like generally you'd be able to plant like a spring cover crop as soon as the ground is kind of dry enough to work, like and the snow's gone. So really anytime in March that it's dry enough, it's not going to be like too cold to the middle or end of March for that sort of stuff. And I would say like, if you're not going to plant anything until like after frost, if you're planting like eggplant at the end of May, or if you're planting soybeans at the end of May, you're getting into a realm where like it's a couple months, I would say, like but it's not a hard and fast sort of rule where it's like, oh, if it's 4 weeks, but 2 months is plenty of time for those spring covers, especially oats, to really put on a lot of biomass and get a benefit that's worth kind of the extra labor and seed costs of doing that cover cropping. With oats, you're talking about probably like $18-20 for 55 pounds or something. So like, like $40 an acre of seed, which is, is not nothing, but yeah.
And if I have used that technique myself, and maybe it wasn't quite dead when we put in the eggplants, but it wasn't really flourishing either.
Mhm.
How much do you think that cover crop is interfering with the cash crop at that point? I mean, let's just say it got mowed and it got, tarped for a week, and then we planted into the detritus there. But there might be a pea or, maybe an oat that, continue to grow. Do you think it's doing much of interference there?
I would say it's doing like the same amount of interference as like a similar amount of weeds would be doing, basically. Like, if you, which like, like, I mean, obviously it's easiest to kill weeds when they're little, but like, I don't think, if you have nobody, it's stressful to see, an inch tall lamb's quarters, like blanketing your fields or whatever. But when they're that little, they're actually probably not doing a lot of damage. It's just stressful because they're gonna get to be 4 foot tall lamb's quarters, and like you're gonna have, it's like about to be a bigger issue. But with kind of a few stragglers, like that's, yes, they are competing with your cash crop, but especially when you're talking about like transplants going in that are pretty small, as long as they're not, bunching around that, I doubt that that's going to have, more of too much of an issue. And I don't think you really end up having, those are pretty green leafy residues. If you have something like where you're, with a more carbon rich residue, you definitely can have issues with like the microbial community being sort of set up for like being a sort of decomposition focused microbial community rather than a sort of symbiosis with the living plant roots microbial community that you might get with and you're just a little bit out of sync with that sort of thing. But no, I doubt that, like, like you just kill them when you come back to weed, and then
Right.
yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Alicia. If tarps kill cover crops by depriving plants of light, would a heavy canvas tarp or a thick layer of cardboard work just as well as opposed to plastic?
I mean, yeah, like I think like part of the I think one of the challenges with like woven tarps and is that the plants can often find like a little way to get through them. And then once they have just a tiny little, the first little bit of a leaf through a tarp, then they can, kind of do what, like any little hole can get through it. And I do think, yeah, it can just be, I think, more challenging in my experience, which is not, I haven't like, used the kind of like a more of a landscape fabric or cardboard on like a big scale. Just like, in little bits. And I think I wonder if it's more of kind of an edges issue than like, I would think the middle of the, big piece of cardboard would do perfectly fine. But if they can get around the edges, then you can end up with the same, with them getting through.
Right. And we had David answer, Alicia. I'll just read that. In my experience, the heat and suffocation also help. I've tried woven plastic, canvas, and cardboard, and they work much less well than a solid tarp, but do work depending on what you're killing. Okay. Those are great scenarios. If anybody else has a scenario that they'd like us to talk about, then please put it in the chat. I have one scenario that I'd like to bring up that a fellow farmer and I both planted rye in the fall. Both of us are no-till permanent bed type hand scale farmers. And I terminated that rye before I was going to plant summer squash in around Memorial Day by mowing and then tarping it for approximately a week to 10 days. And it was hard to plant into because you had so many little rye plants, but they were all dead. And so we planted the summer squash directly into the dead plants. So no tillage whatsoever. My colleague farmer did the same thing, except that he put seed in, summer squash seed, and not a single one germinated. We were just trying to figure out what might have happened. Is there a allelopathy type of effect with rye that perhaps prevented germination? What would you think might have occurred?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I am not, I guess like I have certainly people plant a fair amount direct seeded into rye of like, especially in like field crops world, and especially in like non-organic circumstances where they might like do a direct seeding of corn or soybeans and then at the same time or immediately afterwards use a herbicide and not mow or anything. I like there's just a lot of things that could happen. I think something I didn't mention, I think I forgot to mention in the talk, is that you get like a pretty different suite, you can just get like, at least in my experience, kind of different pests in no-till systems than you'd get in than you read about in sort of a pest handbook that's more tillage focused, which most of our resources are tillage focused, and just like and so it's totally possible that like you either have something like slugs just coming and just eating the baby plants before they even come up. I've definitely had plants just like in no-till fields and experiments that I've been doing where it's just like, oh, it planted this, like why aren't they here? And I think that is really challenging, especially with direct seeded stuff. But I'm not sure that there's either one answer all the time, or that if there is, I'm not, I don't know what it is. I think the plants are just kind of more sensitive at that seedling stage.
Right. And Daniel asks, any thoughts on quick cover crops in season like buckwheat or mustards?
Yeah, and I see there's been a response to that of someone saying, Andrew saying, sorghum, sun hemp, sunflower, cowpea, millet, buckwheat are a good summer mix for him. And that, yeah, that's going to be great, especially like if, I don't know if everybody here is from Massachusetts, like if you go, I think in a little bit colder than us, some of the really heat loving plants like cowpea and sun hemp are going to be, if you were way up in the Berkshires or something, I wouldn't plant those until, maybe like July or something. But they do great where I am in the Connecticut River Valley. And some of those are going to be a little bit longer, like sorghum, sun hemp, sunflowers. Those are really great summer mixes, especially for like a full summer fallow, where if you had like 3 months or something. Um, with quick stuff like buckwheat is kind of the very classic, like, hey, I've got a month between my, like, in the summer between something in the spring and something in, even a month, if your spring crops are coming out in July and you want to plant rye in September, like, buckwheat can just be a great way to get, a ton of really high quality habitat um, for insects. Like if you ever mow a buckwheat field, like it's like there's so many insects there. It's wild how much insects love buckwheat. Um, and I would say, like, as far as termination goes, like buckwheat's a pretty easy one. That, like, it's pretty sensitive. It's one of the few cover crops that you almost can just mow, and if you mow it low, um, you're not going to consistently kill a whole field of buckwheat with a mower. But you're gonna almost, if you get it like an inch off the ground or something, you'll kill most of it. Almost oftentimes, if I mow a field of buckwheat, it'll all be dead except for where the wheels like pushed it over before the mower got there. And so you have like a stripe where because it was pushed over, it got mowed, with 6 inches of stem. And so it's coming back from that. You do have to worry a little bit about seed production with buckwheat and having, but even a pretty light tillage would be good for buckwheat. And yeah, mustards are gonna, like, not do as well in the heat of the summer. They're a great quick, once you get into like September is a great 1 month cover. They get so big and so beautiful. Again, similar to buckwheat, lots of flowers on some mustard plants will, some brassica family crops will flower really quickly, and that'll be really, again, great for the insects.
Okay, good. And speaking of mowing, Jay is asking, if one mows to terminate a cover crop, why is tillage necessary as well? I'm assuming the mowing is down as low as possible to the ground. I think you might have touched on this a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is that, like, you can kind of almost think about there being like, that tillage is just like really aggressive mowing where you're mowing part of the roots. And like once with, like, say with a flail mower or something, like you can actually hit the very top of the soil with a flail mower if you really want to get down there. And that, I think, that's not going to kill rye, in a vegetative state or something. It's certainly not going to, really take out a lot of clover, but for a lot of crops, that's going to be enough. But yeah, generally, basically, most of these plants will have, some sort of crown right around the soil level. And if that crown is still alive and you take off the top, the plant will try and regrow from that crown. Whereas if you sort of separate that crown from the roots, then you get a lot more of the plants like fully dying. Vetch would be one where, like, it grows right along the ground, and so, like, it's not gonna. But I would say for some, like, the things that work a little bit better for mowing would be something like buckwheat that's, pretty upright and sensitive. And then with small grains, like, if there's a point where, they're an annual crop, and so they're going to try and make their seeds and then die. And there definitely is a point where where they're just on their way to dying no matter what. And if you come and mow them, that'll kind of, essentially get them down enough. Something I'm kind of interested in is you will get, more viable seeds, the longer you let something like rye go. Something I've noticed with roller crimping is that the seeds, even if there are viable seeds, they're so far off the ground after roller crimping that they don't you don't get them, like they might sprout on the head of the rye during the season, but they're not in the soil. They can't really become weed problems. They're just like a sprouted head of rye. And so I do wonder, like, and especially in a field where, say, you're going to plant rye again the next fall anyways, like, if you can just keep them from, being a weed problem during the year, and especially in a no-till system where, they're not getting mixed back in the soil, like, how, is that okay to have, some more viable seeds than in a tillet? I would say the conventional wisdom is like, you don't want any viable rye seeds because, if you till that in, you're going to just have like a ton of volunteer rye and it's going to compete with your crop and be a pain in the ass. But if you're in a no-till system, I'm interested. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I would think that would be less of a problem than in a tilled system where those viable seeds don't have the same chances of getting. And so if that's the case, then, mowing like a pretty mature rye plant might be a great way to, get that residue out of the way and give it kind of a push into dying.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about how these seeds are applied. Obviously, if a smaller grower doesn't have a seeder, how to seed the seeds properly is always a challenge, especially if there's late crops like a Brussels sprout planting there still, and they want to interseed a cover crop. What are some of the best types of or ways to broadcast it? And are there certain cover crops that are better not to broadcast because unless they're covered with soil are not going to germinate and do well?
Yeah, I would say, generally the bigger the seed, the more soil contact it's going to need. So, so you're going to have, which like a lot of what we typically use for winter cover crops, because we want them to grow, really vigorously and get off to it. We use mostly large seeded crops for these winter cover crops because we just want them to hit the ground. We want them to sprout, have a lot of energy in that seed to really pop up out of the ground and grow. And we don't, honestly, we don't care that much about other stuff. That's like all we want. That's not all we want, but like that's a big thing, as opposed to, I think people like, if you think about like direct seeding carrots, it's like, yeah, if we could have a carrot seed that's like 4 times as big, that probably would be a lot easier. But like we have other things that we want with carrots, so like breeding them to have gigantic seeds is not really a priority. But I think, I I'm a like, maybe I'm a little bit of a raking evangelist. Like um I think like a nice rake is really, really, really useful after broadcasting. It's like a spring rake, but not, like a springy rake that's heavy duty enough that it's not, gonna get all bent and stuff, but you're not gonna move a lot of soil. Um, will get a lot of cover in a pretty quick period of time after broadcasting. And I think that's like totally worthwhile. I've definitely been out there with like, with like dirt rakes and just like, and that's just a ton of work, just pushing
Yeah.
the dirt back and forth. But you can obviously, you can have rakes on the back of a tractor that you can just drive back and forth and get, really pretty good coverage in there. And you can get you can certainly get a tractor rake for maybe $1,000, which is not crazy for an implement. But you can also get like a hand rake for $50 for a really nice one. And depending on the scale you're at, you can basically rake in cover crop seeds like at the pace, at a fast walk.
Yeah.
So the amount of time it takes you to walk a bed, you can do a 2-foot strip, and then just said, I'm a big fan of rakes.
That's
for
funny
that
you
sort of
mentioned
stuff.
that. My crew discovered that last year. One was doing the broadcasting with the that red bag earthway seeder, and
Yep.
the other one was following along with the rake, and it all came up, which was great. I also find that if the bed doesn't have plants on it, the earthway seeder with the P plate can be really beneficial to get the oats and peas under the soil and really get as many rows on that bed as possible. 6, 8 really close together has worked really, really well too.
Yep.
Somebody else is mentioning the Johnny's Tilther works great in small spaces. And Andrew is saying, I'm allowing spring covers to go to seed in my fall broccoli fields, then tarp for 3 weeks after zone tilling. The peas and oats come back in between with minimal competition. Interesting.
Nice.
And then Daniel says, I use a BCS with precision depth roller at 1 inch. Okay, great, really great ideas. So we're getting close to the hour, 5:30, when we will be ending. And this has been so helpful and informative, I must say. I think that all farmers are constantly thinking about a cash crop and also wanting to do better in getting cover crops in. And I must say that once they are in, it is demonstrably noticeable what a benefit they do give your next crop. So whatever we can do to keep those soils covered over the winter and summer for that matter is something that we should strive to do. Any last minute questions? I just put the evaluation form again in the chat for all of you to complete. I had also earlier posted the auction. I'm going to do that again for those that joined us later. And we have some cover crops on the NOFA bulk order too that you can order. There's some mixes and there's some individual cover crops that you can order through the end of January and get a bulk discount based upon all of the member purchases or non-member purchases as well. And there is the bulk order link. And one more, there is a vendor marketplace. And if you're buying seeds from High Mowing, there's a discount there when you go visit, which is great. Thank you so much, Arthur. You've been really wonderful to have. This is such an important topic, and we hope to have you back for more discussion about cover crops.
For sure. Thanks everybody for being here. It was really great having everybody here.
And we do have Arthur's slides on a PDF. If anybody would like that, you can certainly reach out to me at lauradavis@nofamass.org.
Yeah, and my email's on those slides, and I'm happy to talk about specific issues that people have that come up, or any or just hypothetical things, or just hear about what's working on everybody's farms.
Great. Thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a nice evening. And don't forget, we have more great workshops and the keynote tomorrow morning, Sunday, and hope you'll be able to join us again. Stay warm.
Bye, everybody.